Deciding it had been a good number of years since I was at the Game Developers Conference in California, I bought a ticket and attended it under the Expo program, where I get to walk around the Expo floor and go to one or two talks. But primarily, I was walking around, meeting old friends, seeing people and games and companies that I hadn't interacted with in years. And almost by impulse, I tried going about a different way to go through the Expo floor, and I think I may have stumbled onto something. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Jeff Atwood, Daniel Boyd, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. The Game Developers Conference, GDC, happens at a series of buildings at the Moscone Center in San Francisco. Tens of thousands of people are attending, but mostly it is meant to be for game developers to work with each other and to talk about their experiences and, to a smaller extent, sell people on things. I don't know how much of the third actually happens, but it must happen enough for the amount of booths that are everywhere. There are companies dedicated to motion capture, to payment processing, to games and independent works, and while their sizes are variant and their staff are either hired or part of the company, there's a hungriness to the floor, expecting people to walk up, engage, and allow them to make the pitch about their product. As usual, I was dressed a little bit exotically, with my top hat and loud suit, and initially I thought I would walk to one or two booths, get some information, and call it a day. But I suddenly got this other idea. What if I started at one corner of the floor and moved through the over 100 booths one by one, regardless of content, regardless of the business, the game, the entity in that booth? How far could I get? What would I find? And, most importantly, what would I gain by doing this? And here's where I'll spoil it all for you. It turned out I stumbled into a very interesting and very exciting way to approach game history. By not letting myself be guided towards the most interesting things, by playing a curatorial role on that floor and only going for the best, the brightest, the most competent, the most practiced, I engaged with a whole range of people who were either new to this whole process, maybe this was their first Game Developers Conference, and businesses that are used to being completely ignored day after day. There were people who I would walk up to, who would compliment me on what I was wearing, find out I worked for the Internet Archive, let me know that they loved the Internet Archive, and I would ask them if they had any pamphlets, business cards, or other tokens of their existence in the modern, present era. And most of them did. Many of them had small booklets or postcards or business cards, and they would hand them to me, and I would put them in a bag. After that, I would have a short conversation with them. I would ask them what they were up to. I would sometimes play the games that they were offering, or simply hear the pitch of what they were doing, because many of them had been hired just to handle the booth. They weren't employees of whatever was running that booth. Their entire job was to sit on a stool and hand out pamphlets and answer very quickly what the company, what the entity or the title was doing. And this dynamic led to some very interesting conversations, because people who are not invested in the success of the final product can either be very blunt, very truthful, or conversational, since the outcome is the same. Friday rolls around and they close up shop. They handed me all sorts of toys and trinkets, booklets and books, and we had conversations about whatever each individual booth's center meaning was. In the case of the independent games, you would have students who were working towards becoming game makers who were full of life and excitement. And when I would tell them that I was from an archive and that I was collecting their business cards and information about their booths for the future, you could see their eyes grow wide. The idea of somebody thinking them important enough to capture in the moment had never occurred to them. One of my favorite things was talking to somebody and pointing to them and saying, in 20 years, people are going to be amazed that you were here. And I wasn't lying either. This is where the next generation of game makers come from, the next people who lead teams, the next ones who lead companies. They start out going to expos and showing their wares and then getting jobs in the industry and moving up until they don't have to be at the booths. Maybe it's a gift, an autograph session for them to show up. And you never, ever know who that's going to be. Every year of GDC represents whatever is hot or new in their world. For example, motion capture, payment processing, new engines and gear, and publishing models. Some of these companies could temporarily contract workers for you or provide server space for your testing. Some of them were testers and would allow you to check the quality without having to hire 40 or 50 people who you are only going to keep for 6 to 8 months. Other ones, they were selling air. Cryptocurrency-based games, metaverse guides, NFTs, AI transcription services, AI generation services. Companies that felt like they were 3 or 4 days old and wouldn't last another month. They had simple booths, ones you could put together in a weekend, where you would print out a large banner, put it up against a table, have a bunch of business cards printed, and you were good to go. Maybe you'd have people wear a certain kind of outfit or give them a t-shirt representing your logo. I talked to a dozen or so of those companies, and again, while my normal reaction would be to walk right by them, having a few moments with them to understand that these were people who had found themselves with a job that won't age very well was no strike on them. They were going where the jobs were, and when the jobs are based on hype, they're still jobs for many people. There were a couple standouts at this expo, and I'll say that every one of them teaches me a lesson. Naturally, the Video Game History Foundation had a beautiful display of historical software and computer parts and had a way for you to get your photo taken by a Game Boy, which it would print out. And while Frank and Phil helmed the booth, all sorts of old friends of mine stopped by when I would rest at their table, and I would have wonderful conversations with people I hadn't seen in years. Later, I would see photos of celebrities in the programming and game space who were all attracted to this honest presentation of history that wasn't pushing you towards some new product. There were also booths that were dedicated in their weird way to Web3 and crypto, and they had an art all their own. Shallow, vapid, but still a snapshot. A feeling that you would get walking in and seeing how they were presenting themselves as, big capital letters, the future. I've always been a little fascinated with the carpeting and plastic walls and banners that come in the expo space, all designed to collapse down into flat boxes that are easily transportable. And the way this all comes together with 1 or 2 days of building and a day or two of knocking things down. There was one metaverse company that really caught my eye, because when I walked up, I saw they had a stack of the same book. A big, professionally printed book with a robot head on it, and what was clearly the hastily thrown together manifesto of the CEO of the company. I inquired if the books were free. They were. All I had to do was get my badge scanned, which would put me on a mailing list, and frankly, I can deal with a mailing list. So in my hands, I had this beautifully put together mess of a manifesto of what the metaverse would provide to us. That we were so lucky to have a book of everybody's life philosophy or their business ideas or their opinions, happily put into a bound work that we could refer to each successive year and see how far off they were. There's one booth that will probably stay in my mind for a very long time. And this booth was very quiet. It had a screen with a space game that you could call generic, and it had a number of large coffee table books underneath it, and the person running the booth was looking at their phone and very surprised that I walked up. I was looking at these different pamphlets, and I grabbed one, and I reached for the book, and she had to explain to me that the book was not available to take away. It was a prospectus book. So I asked to look through it, and I was stunned. Not at the proposition. It was yet another game where you go through space and trade and fight and grow plants. It was that whoever was behind this product had created a 4-color, professionally printed, multi-100-page prospectus of what this future massively multiplayer game could be. And not just a regular book, although there was one that felt like an art book. There was a massive one, a coffee table book worthy of the finest library. Hundreds of pages, incredibly thick, full of images. And I asked, "What is this for?" And she said, "For potential investors. My boss is very unique." And I didn't have the heart to tell her he wasn't that unique. I've seen echoes of people like this for decades. They have a lot of money, and they have a dream. And they begin working on their dream. And specifically, they work on one of the most hard projects a human being can do, a massively multiplayer role-playing game. And it doesn't matter if it's in a forest or on a space station or on a mountaintop. The game represents one of the most complicated interactions you could imagine. You have to account for player personalities. You have to generate reams and reams of content to be able to have people walk through it. And you have to be constantly updating it. You are talking millions and millions of dollars. Even if you think about the modern era of generative AI, you're still going to have to curate it, handle it, figure out what the themes are, work with teams to promote it, get feedback from your player base, all the time bleeding money from every pore. But he had this dream, and he had made 2 large books about it. And I told her, please, please donate these books to the Strong Museum of Play, to some other institution in the future. Because I had never seen a game that was portrayed in its dreamlike state before all of the crashing realities happened in such a professional package. I don't know if that request stuck around, but the cramped style of the booth meant I would have never walked over to it if I wasn't playing this game. And it was a game. The game to collect all of the paper from all of the booths, to meet all of the people, to talk to everyone about everything, to be given strange pitches from Central Asian game development companies and from nonprofits, to be given all of these incredible pitches from every corner of the world assembling. Did I win? Well, I produced a box of history. I labeled it, I closed it with tape, and I put it into the stacks at the Internet Archive. In a few years or a few decades, somebody is going to open that box. It might be me. It might be someone else. And they are going to feel like they found the treasure trove of that year. The evidence, the observations, the toys, the artifacts, they are all in there. So this is where I am going to start saying to people, this is the way to go through a conference or an exposition in the future. Collect the artifacts, put them into a box, label the box, put it away. Gather up evidence of what things were. And people, in just a few decades, will think of you as a prescient, forward-thinking genius. And in terms of playing a game, that's a pretty good way to win. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It. Thanks to James Bekoyanu, Ernie Hershey, Michael Rubin, Dilip Reddy, Sean Kelly, Trixie the Cat, Martin, Symbionts, Benjamin Guts, and Anonymous, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. There was one other artifact that I collected. One of the cryptocurrency Web3 booths made a parody of Nintendo Power, but made it all about blockchain in a open-eyed, self-deluded presentation about how great it was. They took the graphic style, the writing style, the formatting and layout of Nintendo Power and reimagined it for their blockchain games. I had it. I showed it to Frank Cifaldi of the Video Game History Foundation, and his eyes got so wide. And I told him, take it, scan it, we'll put it on the Internet Archive, and we will capture, for all of time, this bizarre little paper artifact in a waterfall of pamphlets. Maybe we'll just call that a successful side quest.